Exorcisms. They have been practiced for as long as funerals have been performed. In any country or culture, if there's a ritual to do away with the body, then there's a ritual to do the same with the soul. Ancient Rome was no different. Before there were prayers, crosses, and holy water, there were incantations, bronze pans, and beans. Yes, beans. And before there were short, tearful goodbyes for our loved ones, there were long drawn-out festivities and animal sacrifices. Thus were ancient Roman exorcisms and funerals. Because it is easier to explain, we will begin with the exorcism. Though it was somber and perhaps at the time quite frightening, it did not have the sense of urgency and dread as modern exorcisms have today, especially in film and television. It was instead a holiday known as Lemuria, celebrated annually by all citizens. This celebration took place in May, lasting about a week, although only the 9th, 11th, and 13th were officially part of the holiday, as even-numbered days were considered unlucky. The word Lemuria has two possible meanings. The first one could originate from the lemurs, or larvae, which were malignant or restless spirits haunting a household. Others believe that it comes from the word Remuria, derived from the name Remus, Romulus's twin brother. According to the legend, the founder twins fought over the location of their new city, and after a long dispute, Romulus killed his brother and went on to become the first king of Rome. Allegedly, Remus returned to haunt his brother after his death. In the effort to calm his spirit, Romulus gave the name Remuria to the ceremony for the appeasement of buried ancestors. All that remains is to answer the question of how the practice of exorcising spirits in ancient Rome was done. Before the proper ceremony began, certain precautions were taken. First and foremost, all participants in the ritual must be clean and washed. Secondly, nuts were forbidden during the ceremony, as they were said to disrupt the natural forces from flowing through the home and homeowner. And lastly, every member in the household must be barefoot when performing the ritual. Once everything was set and ready, the special rites would formally begin. The time would be midnight, when the head of the household, known as the paterfamilias, would wander through the entire property. While doing so, he would take a handful of black beans and throw them over his shoulder. It was believed that the spirits would be drawn to the beans and move towards them, instead of crowding around the living. Every few handfuls of beans, the paterfamilias would make a hand sign called the mano fica, or the fig hand, in which the thumb would rest between the forefinger and the middle finger. This sign would protect him and others from evil. Once the entire property had been cleansed, the paterfamilias chanted the following incantation: "These I send. With these beans, I redeem me and mine." This incantation was repeated a total of 9 times. It was then that the rest of the household would join in by banging pieces of bronze or clashing bronze pots together, chanting loudly, "Spirits of my fathers and forefathers, be gone." This too was done 9 times. Once all the rites were properly followed for 3 nights, it was believed that all the spirits would be pacified and their thirst for harm would be quenched, at least until the next year. Even after all the proper rites had been performed, citizens were still not out of the water. It was believed that the entire month of May was the month for caution. In fact, it was such an unfortunate month that weddings were discouraged, going so far as to spread rumors that only bad girls got married in May. And speaking of weddings, the ancient Romans feared bad spirits and bad omens so much that as a way to protect the happy couple, all guests dressed exactly like the bride and groom. This would confuse the spirits and make it unable for them to target the couple. What's more, as the bride was the focus of the wedding, extra forms of protection were established specifically for her. The veil, a garment so frequently used nowadays, began in ancient Greek and Roman times. It was first intended to hide the bride from evil spirits who would have otherwise attached themselves to her and make her miserable in her marriage. It was also said to bring protection against the evil eye and envious thoughts from other women. A duty to one's ancestors was fundamental to Roman culture. Ancient Romans believed that when people were given the proper funeral rites and honored with memorials, their spirits protected their descendants. If the opposite happened, the living would suffer their revenge. The only exception were newborns and children. Their souls did not become distressed if the funeral rites were not given properly. The reason for this is because they were considered pure. Let's begin and go through the process of a funeral. If the deceased came from a wealthy family, the body could remain at their family home for several days. While the funeral rites were in process, the doors of the family home were closed. Cypress branches decorated the entrance, both as a sign and as a warning that those who entered risked becoming polluted. Dead bodies were considered to be pollutants, and if touched, people were required to partake in long, complex cleansing rituals to be morally and religiously pure again. And so, for 7 to 9 days, all daily routine ceased, and the entire family, having been in contact with a dead body, were considered unclean and to be avoided. A typical funeral for a person of high status went as follows: the first ceremony at home, the procession, the cremation, then finally the feast. The entire family gathered around their dying loved one, so one of them, usually the oldest son, could offer the last kiss. This gesture captured the last breath and freed the soul of the dying person. Then, the same relative called the deceased person's name one last time. Of course, going unanswered, the deceased's eyes were then closed, if they weren't already. His body was then washed and dressed in his finest toga. He was placed in a funeral couch, where his limbs were stretched with his feet pointed towards the entrance. As strange as this may sound, his body was left on display for 7 to 9 days until the actual funeral. Like everything else, the procession was proportionate to one's wealth. For the poor, processions were simple. It was nothing more than a short train of family and neighbors, with a couple of flute players at the lead. For the rich, funerals were magnificent. As we said earlier, the band of musicians marched at the lead. Music was so prominent in Roman burials that there was a genre dedicated to it, and musicians specialized in it. Then came the deceased, carried by male relatives in an elaborate palanquin. Up next came the female mourners, who were encouraged to grieve openly. In fact, there were tales of families hiring professional mourners, women who would cry, scream, and scratch at their faces until they bled. After them walked the actors, who were hired to wear masks made out of wax called imagines, or ancestral masks. They would pretend to be the dead person's ancestors. One actor would dress up as the deceased person himself and reenact all his great deeds before taking a spot next to his ancestors. After them came the family, all wearing funeral garments, like the toga pula or the dark toga for the men. Then came the freedmen, the family slaves, and finally the friends. The procession would end when it reached the site of cremation, often a place called enustrinum. What followed was a ceremonial feast. A pig was sacrificed and roasted. The food was shared among all the mourners and the deceased, which meant that a plate of food was left aside for the dead loved one. After the feast, the pyre was lighted by the male heir, who kept his eyes averted while doing so. After the fire burnt out, the last embers were put out with either wine or water. It was then that the mourners called out their final goodbyes to the deceased. The ashes were then dried and collected into an urn, which was then buried. Afterwards, a period of 9 days of mourning took place. After that, some families had a second feast, but no one ate in it. Instead, the meat was burned to ashes as part of a cleansing ritual. Once that was accomplished, the mourning period was over. Men wore their regular togas and returned to their obligations. The families were considered cleansed and could carry on with their own lives once again. That concludes this video on ancient Rome's take on death and funeral practices. What's interesting is that this is just scratching the surface on how committed people were to maintaining a good relationship with their buried relatives. In fact, there was even a word expressing this type of sentiment, pietas, the fierce devotion and duty to one's parents, ancestors, and countrymen. But perhaps that is a topic for another time. For now, we'll just leave it right here. Thank you for listening until the end. I wish you a pleasant evening, and I'll see you in the next video.